So there we go. So yes, I just wanted to say how thrilled we are to have this presentation today with Dr. Arielle Silverman. And just a little bit of an introduction. Born without sight, Dr. Silverman has spent a lifetime exploring ways to foster respect and inclusion, not only for blind people like her, but for all of us whose bodies and minds may differ from the norm. And Dr. Silverman is a prominent and a very respected disabled activist and social scientist, and I'm interested in that because I'm a psychologist. And she spent 15 years conducting research on the social psychology of disability. Dr. Silverman is the author of a very highly regarded book called Just Human: The Quest for Disability Wisdom, Respect, and Inclusion. And after the introduction, I will put in the chat the link where you can find information about the book. You can find information in the chat room about the book, and it's available for purchase on Amazon. It has great reviews on Amazon. I took a look at them, and the reviews call this book a must-read for educators, for healthcare teams, for lawyers, for parents, for everyone. So quite impressive. Today, Dr. Silverman will share with us her experiences as a blind Jewish woman, coming to terms with stereotyping and discrimination. And Dr. Silverman will offer us, our Temple community, practical ways to make Jewish spaces like ours as inclusive as possible. So it is my great honor to welcome Dr. Arielle Silverman to Temple Sinai. And thank you so much for agreeing to do this presentation. So I'll hand off the presentation to you.
All right, thank you so much. And this is meant to be an interactive kind of presentation. So as I'm going through my spiel, if you have comments, questions, thoughts, feel free to write them in the chat. You don't have to wait until the end because I don't want people to lose, momentum with the thoughts that they want to contribute. So feel free to type things into the chat, and we'll have a couple to pause and take questions and comments. I also am joined tonight by my friend and colleague, Dan Hodges, who's sitting on the other side of my balcony. And he also does a lot of speaking related to inclusion. So at a couple of points, he might, especially if we're running ahead of schedule, might jump in and share some of his thoughts about some of these concepts. So I figured that it might be interesting and potentially useful for everyone to hear a little bit about my background and about some of the pivotal experiences that I've had throughout my life that have kind of deepened my understanding of what inclusion is and the different forms that stereotyping and prejudice and discrimination can take and the impacts that those things can have on people. I think probably the most unique aspect of my identity is the fact that I am both blind and Jewish, which is something that, of course, I highlight whenever I speak to Jewish audiences. And because being blind and being Jewish are both, or even being disabled and being Jewish are both minority kinds of identities, Jews make up about 2% of the world's population, and people with disabilities are actually a lot more common than you might think. By some estimates, up to 26% of people throughout the world has a disability. But blindness is considered a low incidence disability, so less than 1% of people identify as being blind or having difficulty seeing even when they're wearing glasses. So to come from kind of those two small minority groups that don't really intersect, I mean, of course there are, I'm not the only blind and Jewish person in the world, but there's not a whole lot of intersection between those two groups. It's interesting to think about how both of those identities have played out and how the interaction between them sometimes has led to exclusion or marginalization in one group and not the other, which I'll get into in a little bit more specific detail. So a little bit of background, and this is all highlighted in my book, which I hope several of you will consider picking up a copy of my book. I was born in mid-1980s in Phoenix, Arizona, and my parents first discovered when I was a couple months old that my eyes had kind of an odd pattern of movement and didn't seem to focus. And it took me to an ophthalmologist who said that I had nystagmus, which is basically just a kind of condition where your eye movements are unusual, but that doesn't necessarily cause vision loss. But then I got to be like a couple months older, and my parents noticed that I wasn't like looking at people or looking at toys or tracking movement with my eyes. And so they got a second opinion, and it turned out that I have a rare genetic condition that's known as Leber congenital amaurosis, or LCA, that has caused me to be born with near total blindness. I can see light. I can see if the light's on or off, or if somebody flashes a light. I can see a little bit of motion if it's right in front of my face. And sometimes I can see outlines of large objects. But I've never been able to see color or any sort of detail, like, being able to read any print letters, no matter how big they are, or recognize any objects by sight alone. And the first kind of theme that's important to keep in mind is that, like most people who are born with a disability, I have never known anything different. So I never missed being able to see. I certainly had curiosity about what it was like to be able to see. But I never like felt sad or like I was deprived of anything, or felt like my life was deficient because I didn't have vision. Because for me, normal experience includes, the 4 other senses, and then of course inner thoughts and feelings. But vision was just not even ever on my radar, except when it mattered to other people. And of course, we know that in popular culture, blindness is one of the most feared diseases in the world. By some estimates, only surpassed by AIDS and cancer in terms of how much people are afraid of becoming blind. Definitely. And there are just a lot of negative conceptions about what blindness is like for blind people, and a lot of pity and other kind of negative reactions that people have. So I had to go through this whole process as I was growing up. And of course, everyone as they grow up kind of learns more and more about the world around them, and about how their experience is similar to other people's, and how their experience is different from other people's. So I had to go through kind of different stages of understanding what it meant to be a blind person in a sighted world. And then of course, being Jewish in many ways was a lot easier, because being Jewish is, and if anybody's read the book by Andrew Solomon called Far from the Tree, he talks about horizontal and vertical identities. So vertical identities are the identities that we share with our families of origin. And in most cases, unless you're Jewish by choice, being Jewish is something that you share with members of your immediate family. And of course, I was born and grew up in a Jewish family. So being Jewish was an identity that I shared with everyone in my family, and in fact, a lot of my peers. Whereas being blind was something that I did not share with anyone in my family. And I got to know blind friends and had a blind peer group, which I'll talk about a little bit later, but that didn't come right away. And I was fortunate to grow up in a place where there was not a lot of open anti-Semitism or anything like that. So being Jewish never really felt like a marginalized identity, but being blind definitely did, because people have these sometimes very obvious and sometimes more subtle misconceptions about what it's like to be blind. So I went through these different stages that are kind of outlined in my book. So initially, as a child, I did go to a preschool that was a specialized preschool for blind children, and I was very lucky in that regard. So I learned Braille, and learned to use a cane, and learn all of those foundational skills. At least I got kind of introduced to them before I started kindergarten at the age of 5. And then I went to public elementary school. And when I was in preschool and moving into kind of early elementary grades, I did not know that other people had a different experience from my own. So I didn't understand what color was. I heard people talk about things being red or blue or green, and I memorized, the grass is green and the sky is blue, but it didn't have any meaning. It was just kind of a nursery rhyme. I didn't necessarily understand that in kindergarten, the teacher would have these print cards and would hold them up, and I would hear the kids say letters out loud. And I didn't realize that they were actually reading those cards, because I read Braille and I thought that everybody read that way. I didn't necessarily understand that other kids and other adults around me had access to information that I did not have access to. And I didn't feel sad or, any negative feelings about it, because that was just the way it was. And then, of course, like all children, I started to understand that people are different in certain ways. And in the book, I write about my experience learning about race initially through an academic unit at school in second grade. That was like a Martin Luther King thing, tutorial about, Martin Luther King, what he did in the civil rights movement. And I went home and I asked my family if I was Black or white. And I thought I was asking, a pretty basic question about who I was and where I came from. And I didn't realize that there was like a whole bunch of, depth to that question and the meaning of the answer. And so I write about that. And then fast forward to in fourth grade. And at least for me, in fourth grade was when the awareness really started to take hold of the fact that people viewed me differently because I was blind. And as I write about in the book, I think when I was younger than fourth grade, I knew that people sometimes treated me differently from others. And I knew that I was blind, but I did not put the two together. And I didn't realize that the reason people treated me differently than others was because I was blind. And so when we talk about inclusion and we talk about exclusion, sometimes exclusion can be very blatant. You might think of exclusion as, not letting somebody in, like not letting someone come to an event, or not letting them apply for a job, or not hiring them, or not letting them babysit your children, or not denying opportunities. And that certainly is exclusion, and it's something that I did experience at times. But I would say most of the exclusion that I experience today, and even that I have experienced growing up, is a lot more subtle than that. So it would come in the form of, and I started to notice this around fourth grade, that, sometimes adults like teachers or parents or family friends or, my friends' parents, people like that, would talk to me in a different tone of voice. They would talk to the other kids, or they wouldn't allow me to do things like making my own lunch or going out for a walk, for example, that other kids my age were allowed to do. And so there was a sense of infantilization. And a lot of times exclusion is dressed up as, and social psychologists would call this benevolent prejudice. So people would exclude me under the guise of not wanting me to get hurt or wanting to ensure that I was safe. And it wasn't necessarily a lie. I mean, I think people genuinely did care about my safety, and they didn't want me to get hurt. And so it came out of the sense of caring. But it was based on a misconception that blindness equals greater vulnerability to danger. Or sometimes that blindness equals kind of a lesser maturity or less independence compared to same age peers. So exclusion started to manifest that way. And I write about, in chapter 5 of my book, I write about a couple of experiences I had in the fourth grade where I really cemented in my mind the fact that I was part of a marginalized group. There was an incident at school where I got in a fight with another girl, and that I call Stacy in the book, and I slapped her in the face because I felt like she was being condescending toward me. And but it was complicated because this was a girl that I was like a popular girl that I wanted to impress and I wanted to be accepted by. But then I kind of blew it because I felt like she was, treating me as less than because of my disability, and I ended up lashing out against her. And then there was also a situation on a school bus where I was told that because of my disability, I had to sit in the front row. And the way that the kids kind of organized themselves on that particular school bus, all the little kids were in the front and all the big kids were in the back. So I actually being kind of denied social status by being relegated to sitting in the front row of the bus. I'm just going to do a quick time check here. So I want to read a brief segment from chapter 5 because I want to kind of introduce some of these concepts about experiences of exclusion and stigmatization. And this was something that happened when I, shortly after my 10th birthday, so I was still in the 4th grade, and the context is that I was sitting in front of the family computer, and this was the mid-90s, so we did have a computer, we did not have the internet, but we did have like a desktop computer that was set up in one of the bedrooms that we would take turns using, and I was sitting in front of it, and I had been reading some poems by Jacques Luceron that my parents had given me, and I decided that I wanted to try to write the way he did. So I'm going to start to read from my book here. I opened a blank document on the computer. On prejudice, I wrote, imitating Jacques Luceron's heading style. Then the words just flowed onto the keyboard, words I had only half articulated in my head. I wrote, blindness is a trying world when people console me and produce a friendship with me because they pity me for being blind. One must love me for my accomplishments and gifts. Blindness is like a thick layer of sand hiding the many gifts which lay underneath. I know it should say lie, but I was 10 and I didn't know that yet. My editor pointed that out to me, but we didn't change it in the book. My real friends are good archaeologists and excavate my world, but others give up right away because I am blind and they see nothing but my faults. So I wrote that and then I paused, but I realized I had more to say. It was a painful thing to admit, but I felt I needed to continue. Every time I sin, the sand deepens, and only the more careful people push it away. The writing was therapeutic. I closed the document, shut down the computer, and promptly forgot about it. But my mom found the document on the computer and persuaded me to convert it into a poem, and my prejudice poem went viral among their friends. Eventually, it got published in our local newspaper. This prejudice poem was the writing of a lonely disabled girl yearning for true acceptance, but it was much more than that too. It expressed my overwhelming desire, not just to have friends, but to blend in and stop being the object of pity, to not be treated like some kind of delicate china doll who might break at the slightest danger, to be teased and roughhoused and included in secret gossip sessions just like any other 10-year-old girl. Something else, something deep and powerful lurked in that last verse, something that applies to disabled people of all ages with a desire to speak out against injustice. Every time I sin, the sand deepens, captured my growing ambivalence about how I should react to exclusion and discrimination. Should I express my anger and risk being disliked? Or should I be quiet, be the good girl, and risk being disrespected? When I talk back to my teachers, who told me that I couldn't do things because I was blind, and when I slapped Stacy, I sinned. I violated rules of conduct, and I could have driven people away from the very friendship and acceptance I sought. I began to perceive that some people viewed any mistake, any sin I committed as an extension of my blindness, as another strike against me. Only the more careful people can accept me, knowing my anger and the injustice that leads me to it, my vulnerabilities, and my human failings. End of reading there. So I think this brings up a couple of points that are still relevant and that are relevant to a lot of people, particularly those of us with like visible physical disabilities. So that could be people who are blind, people who use mobility aids, people with other types of physical disabilities, is that because our disabilities are obvious to other people react to them, and sometimes the way they react is in this benevolent, condescending kind of way. And we have kind of, sometimes it feels like none of our options are good options for how to respond. So we can either, just kind of go along and say, oh, they're just being nice, they're just trying to be helpful, we'll just let them do their thing. And then we miss out on respect and inclusion because someone might be benevolently denying an opportunity because they're worried about safety or whatever it is. we go along with it, or they might just, if their views are not challenged, we might be liked but not be respected. But then the opposite can also occur if we try to stand up for ourselves, like I did with Stacy in the PE class. If we stand up for ourselves and we do it, maybe people might perceive that we're being too aggressive or assertive when we stand up for ourselves, and then we might be respected but not be liked. And so that was a struggle that, of course, I still have in some situations today, but it was definitely a much bigger struggle when I was younger, and I couldn't necessarily control the types of people that I interacted with or the types of things that I did. And then coming back to this kind of split between being Jewish and being blind, like I said, being Jewish was my vertical identity, and it was, I was in kind of a unique situation because my parents were very close friends with our rabbi and our cantor when I was growing up. So there was kind of a special effort made to ensure that I had access, in terms of being sure that I had access to Braille materials, and that I could have a bat mitzvah that was equal to that of my sighted classmates, and that I had access to Hebrew school and religious school and all that. And so in many ways, I was very included, and being Jewish was a big part of, I got really into a lot of the rituals and the spiritual aspects of it. And then there were other times, again, when I was not included. And so just to give a couple of examples quickly, there was a Jewish summer camp that my sister went to, my older sister went to, who's sighted. And I asked to go to the same camp. And of course, I don't know the whole story because I was a kid, and my parents kind of told me different things, a couple of different things. And I don't know what actually went down. But the gist of it was that the leadership at the camp didn't believe that I could function at the camp safely and independently without some kind of like a full-time assistant. And hiring that kind of full-time assistant was outside of the scope of their budget. And so I was denied the ability to participate. And that definitely had a negative impact on my development of my Jewish identity, especially as I got older and like all my friends were going to this camp or similar camps and I was not. And of course, it made me feel like I didn't belong in that setting. There were also just a couple of other situations, and those aren't really unique to Judaism necessarily, but there were situations at Jewish events where I wasn't included. And again, it was usually related to the nature of the activities that were being done. Either they, required vision, or there was a misconception that they required vision, but they really didn't. And so there were situations where I was not included. And then sometimes the converse was also true. So as I got older, I started attending some activities with blind peers. The place where I went to preschool also began hosting like a summer day camp and some programs on the weekends that I would go to that were a lot of fun and really valuable to my sense of identity as a disabled person. And I gained a lot of affirmation from becoming friends with other people who were also blind, who included me without any of kind of the friction that sometimes occurred with sighted peers. But none of those hosts were Jewish. So sometimes I would run into situations like I had some of my blind peers in high school who tried to, proselytize me a little bit into Christianity. I also remember like a situation at that camp where it was right before Easter and we were given a choice to either decorate Easter eggs or make egg salad. And as a Jew, I didn't grow up with decorating Easter eggs. It didn't have any meaning for me. So I said, oh, well, I like to cook, I'll make egg salad. And it turned out that I was the only one who chose the egg salad because all the other kids, did have Easter in their lives and they really preferred to do the Easter eggs. And so that was a situation where I was in the blind community, and because of my Jewish identity, I did not feel included. So sometimes it created this kind of false dichotomy between my Jewish identity and my blind identity. And I'm just flipping to a page in the book here because I wrote about how that impacted me in terms of pitting those identities against each other, which I think is kind of interesting to explore. Almost there. As I settled into adolescence, I began to feel a kind of splitting of my identity and my social landscape, as if I lived in two different worlds. Most of the time, I lived in the sighted world of school, Hebrew school, and family. I shared much in common with my peers there, especially my Jewish peers. This dominant sighted world held many opportunities for intellectual and spiritual growth, but I was never a full member of the community. In fact, I was denied admission to our state's Jewish summer camp because the camp leaders mistakenly thought I would need constant one-on-one support to be safe at camp. Other times, the exclusion was much less blatant, but still ever present. In this sighted world, I sat on the periphery, trying to blend in, keeping my head down, studying, not making waves. But on those field trips, most Saturdays and for at least a month each summer, and in countless phone conversations in between, I took a trip into the blind world where I was free to be my true self. Instead of lurking on the edges, I put myself in the middle of the fray. I became talkative, boisterous, opinionated, rebellious, and eventually a leader. As my body and mind reached full maturity, I felt the almost universal pull to distinguish myself from my family of origin. Compounding this, I felt deeply alienated from the sighted world as a whole, and so I found myself more and more deeply attracted to the world of the blind, wishing I could live in greater proximity to my blind friends and only making occasional forays into the sighted world instead of the reverse. At the same time, I began to stereotype my sighted peers and elders as shallow, materialistic, judgmental beings. This led to my creation of a blind utopia fantasy. And then we go into some discussion of research on the benefits of affiliation of disabled people with other disabled people. And so it's unfortunate that that happened, but because of those identities being pitted against each other, and because I was an adolescent, I was kind of attracted to the identity that I did not share with my family of origin. So I think ultimately we want to reflect a little bit on how we can prevent that kind of exclusion from occurring in the first place. And before we go into that, just to kind of wrap up my story that I'm building up to, so I ended up attending Arizona State University, and while I was there, I decided that I was very interested in studying social psychology in order to better understand some of these prejudice and stereotyping dynamics. I ended up getting my doctorate in social psychology in 2014 and did some research on that interests a lot of folks now on what happens when people who are sighted simulate blindness, so when they pretend to be blind in order to supposedly learn about the experiences of blind people. And we find that doing that type of activity can actually backfire and increase prejudice because it makes people overestimate how bad it would be to lose their sense of sight because they don't focus on the coping process. They only focus on kind of the early stages of vision loss. And then after I got my degree and I did a postdoctoral fellowship, I started doing some consulting work. And so I worked with some research groups on their research. And then I also started doing some inclusion training presentations and things like that for different groups, including some, a lot of groups in Jewish communities. And that experience, I think, really broadened my concept, first of all, of the disability world. So, like I said at the beginning, blindness is actually a really small fraction of all the people with disabilities who are out there. A lot of disabilities are invisible, so people might not necessarily even, you might not necessarily even know that someone has a particular disability, and people with invisible disabilities can face a lot of challenges that in some ways are kind of the opposite of the challenges that I faced as a visibly disabled person. So whereas I was just wanting people to leave me alone and stop paying attention, so much attention to me, and stop pushing accommodation on me when I didn't need it, a lot of people with invisible disabilities struggle to have their disability recognized or to receive the accommodations that they need. So that's kind of the opposite bias. I've also learned that in the grand scheme of things, blindness is actually one of the least stigmatized disabilities. Blindness and deafness are actually not stigmatized very much compared with, for example, a mental illness, or intellectual and developmental disabilities are stigmatized a lot more. And the type of exclusion and in many cases even human rights violations that people with those disabilities experience are in many cases a lot more drastic than the types of experiences that I had as a blind person. So this work really broadened my understanding of disability as a whole and of a lot of the issues. And I also began to meet different organizations that were in different stages, what I call stages of inclusion. So I had some organizations bring me in who were like really getting it, and they already had inclusion plans, they had done accessibility audits, they had inclusion committees, like they just wanted someone to kind of look at what they were doing and see how they could be doing better. But they really understood like why inclusion was important, and they understood how to execute it. And then at the other end of the spectrum, there were groups that I talked to who did not really have any acquaintance with disabled people at all. And so even just having one disabled person join their congregation, for example, was like a huge thing. And they needed help with accommodating that one individual. Or even just like creating some rhetoric around why it's a good idea to include a disabled person or to allow them to be a part. So it made me think about different stages of inclusion. And at the end of the book, I write about these 5 stages. And I mean, this is just a model that I made up. It's not backed by any research necessarily, but it does seem to be a model that resonates with people. And so I will just briefly go through it because I think it can help you kind of think through what stage you might be at personally, maybe what stage your congregation is at, and how you can move forward. And I would emphasize that these stages are really an oversimplification, because I think a lot of times we can be in more than one stage at the same time. We can skip around the stages. We can, not everybody starts at the first stage, etc. But it's really just like a quick and dirty framework to help you think about where you are in your journey toward inclusion. And so if we start with stage 1, which is actually a stage that fortunately not everyone starts at, because stage 1 is the stage of having kind of negative reactions to disability. And there are a lot of negative reactions that are kind of ingrained within us. If you think about human evolution, we evolved to depend upon one another for survival. So if there was someone in our group who appeared that maybe they had a contagious disease, we would reject them. Or if they appeared like they couldn't work as hard as everyone else to hunt, gather, whatever else had to be done, we might leave them behind. And that might be evolutionarily supported. And so I think a lot of our reactions, negative gut reactions to disability, originate from that evolutionary history. We might feel anxious. We see someone who looks different or talks different or acts different, because maybe it feels like they might be dangerous, or it feels like they might get hurt, or we might offend them by accident. We might say the wrong thing. We don't know what to say. And or we might feel sorry for that person. Or we might just feel like uncomfortable and we don't want to be around that person. We might feel like scared that it reminds us that we might one day become disabled. So there's a lot of just like innate negative reactions that people can have. And people with disabilities are disproportionately more likely to be victims of hate crimes and, really blatant kind of cruelty than people without disabilities. And so all those kinds of reactions and behaviors could be classified as being part of stage 1. So stage 1 is really like actively rejecting people with any type of physical or mental difference. And then stage 2 is more like a neutral reaction. So like if you're in stage 2, you might not really think about people with disabilities like being around, or you might think that it's just kind of a rare occurrence. When, like I said earlier, the estimates are, between 15 and 25% of people in the world have some sort of disability. People in stage 2 might just not, like, they're not going to exclude people with disabilities, but they might also not think of steps that might be important to ensure that spaces are accessible. And then stage 3 is what I like to call the helping stage. And this is a complicated stage because people in stage 3 do have a good heart, and they want to be inclusive because they want to be nice to others that they might view as less fortunate. So some of that kind of condescending, benevolent prejudice that I talked about earlier is really coming from a stage 3 kind of place. Another thing that I kind of forgot to mention, but I do get into in my book quite a bit of detail, is this phenomenon that has been referred to as inspiration porn, which is the idea of taking someone's accomplishment that might just be kind of an ordinary accomplishment and making a big deal about it because the person happens to have a disability, or just generally making a big fuss over either people with disabilities doing ordinary things or people without disabilities providing assistance to people with disabilities. So there are a lot of memes on Facebook and on social media, and sometimes even videos taken or pictures taken of people with disabilities receiving help in a public setting that really glorifies the helping actions of the non-disabled person. And on the surface, this kind of inspiration porn might not seem bad. And that was another thing that I struggle with, I think, particularly in my Jewish community growing up, because, it was a tight-knit community of my parents and a lot of other parents. And, of course, they love to see the kids grow up and do cool things, and they celebrate the kids' accomplishments. But I definitely became aware at some point that the reaction to my accomplishments was greater intensity than the reaction to my sister's accomplishments, for example, or the accomplishments of a classmate of mine who was sighted, who was doing the same thing that I did. And so it might seem okay on the surface, but the problem with this inspiration porn, there's a few issues. I think one of the biggest ones is that it arises from an inferiority belief. So the reason that it's a much bigger deal if someone who is blind gets an A in a class than someone who is sighted, if you really break it down, the only reason that it's a much bigger deal is because it's somehow surprising or unexpected. We don't expect the blind student to have that level of success. And so when they achieve it, it's a big deal. So that's why this inspiration stuff is another sign of stage 3. It's not necessarily excluding, but it's othering and kind of expecting less from people with disabilities. And then stage 4 is what I like to call the equality stage. I think that's the stage that I was in for much of my life. And in the equality stage, you are thinking about the importance of inclusion, and you are being proactive about accommodating and ensuring that access is provided for specific individuals. So in stage 4, if you're hiring someone and you decide to hire a person with a disability, not out of pity like in stage 3, but because that person is actually qualified for the job and you're willing to provide accommodations, or in a congregational example, maybe someone wants to join or wants to come to an event, but they need some sort of support, and so provide that. That's a good thing. The limit of stage 4 is that disabilities are kind of seen as individual situations. So there's not necessarily a regard to making things accessible across the board to everyone. It's just kind of done on a case-by-case basis. Whereas in stage 5, which I call the disability justice stage, this is kind of the point where we are all planning for and anticipating the fact that people with disabilities are part of our groups, and being proactive about ensuring that spaces and information and communications are accessible from the outset, so that if someone does come up who needs access, they can receive it. Stage 5 is also acknowledging that disability is a, marginalized minority characteristic, like a lot of other characteristics that we might think about, and seeing kind of intersectionality so that someone who's disabled and racial minority will have a different experience than someone who's disabled and white, sexual orientation or gender minorities. Those things all can intersect with disability. And yes? Did someone say something?
I think they just had their camera unmuted and just coughed. Sorry, Dr. Arielle.
Yeah, no problem. And so I wrote about how stage 5 is kind of like a utopia, because we can never really be 100% totally accessible to everyone. There are instances of conflicting access needs that you might hear about. For example, maybe one person with low vision might do better if they have more lighting, whereas maybe someone with migraines will struggle with a lot of lighting. That's just one example where you can have conflicting access needs. So it can be challenging to create like universal accessibility for everyone, but stage 5 is something that we can all work toward, we can all keep top of mind, and we can all think about how we can get closer to it. I have a little bit more I can talk about, but I wanted to just see if there are any questions or any reactions to, or anything that you want me to go into a little bit more. Absolutely, it would be good to have a conversation about what stage you feel Temple Sinai is at. Dan, do you have anything to add to this? Do you want to step up closer and?
Sure.
I don't know if I've talked to you about this yet, so.
So I'll kick off. I'll kick off a question by what we were talking about a little earlier. One of the things we were talking about a little earlier that I think might break the ice a little bit. So, just for everybody out there, I am also blind and I have a connective tissue disorder as well. So I have both a visible and an invisible disability, just for context. But Arielle, I wanted to maybe throw out for your question, or just for your thoughts. We were talking earlier about the difference between difficulties we run into based upon the actual, in our case, loss of eyesight, versus the difficulties that come on based upon either structural or societal barriers, things that are actually controllable and not directly related to our eyes. Where would you, just personally spitballing it, where would you place the emphasis? X% is due to vision loss versus Y% is due to societal, structural, just other kinds of things that happen in the world.
Like for me personally, or just generally for everyone who
maybe
has
both.
vision loss? Yeah, I would say, well, for both, actually, I would say like the vast majority is societal and structural problems. I guess the only thing that would be like innately affected by blindness or vision loss is, moving through space without a cane or without any sort of mobility aid is inherently difficult, like regardless of how accessible you make the environment, like just walking around outdoors and knowing where you are without any sort of mobility device, it would be hard. Just like someone with a mobility disability not using a wheelchair and trying to move. But I think that's a pretty easily remediated problem, like just be sure everyone has access to a cane and has training. That the lack of cane training is a real structural problem. And I think most of the like employment disparities are structural in nature. There might be some things that are inherently enjoyable by sighted people that we can't access. I don't personally like those things like I said, aren't really on my radar because I haven't experienced that. But I mean, there might be things that sighted people enjoy. Like, I mean, I think it would be kind of fun to be able to play video games. And there aren't very many accessible video games. Like, it's harder. I mean, you can make an accessible video game, but you have less to work with. So I mean, there's some things that like reduce enjoyment maybe that are inherent to vision loss, but like to actually be able to survive and meet like your psychological needs and physical needs, I feel like it's almost all structural barriers.
I agree, and I think that's one of the things, at least in my work, and I think in yours as well, is the first wall that comes down when people realize, oh wait, the number's not zero by any means, but the number is also way less than 50% when it comes to things that are actually innately related to eyesight that we deal with.
Yeah, I think that's correct.
Does anyone have any questions or comments they would like to share right now? Seth had an interesting comment in the chat about is it okay, Seth, if I share that? He's nodding yes. Dr. Silverman, he said it's a total example of what you were sharing. He said he dated a blind woman in college who had the grades, the drive, and everything to get in the school of social work, but the school's attitude was the person should be a client, not of the social services, not a social worker.
Wow.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, that does happen.
Yeah, I'm not going to ask what decade that was, but I mean, the thing is, I think that still happens, but it's just not as, it's hidden. Like somebody feels that way, but they say it instead, they'll make up another reason not to admit.
I should have added this was in the early 1970s.
Yeah, I've heard a lot of stories from the 70s like that.
Well, but at the same time, I was looking at social work employment ads for, we'll just say, a major hospital in the Midwest and leave it there. 6 years ago, I think. And the need to be able to see X amount here, X amount, etc., was actually erroneously and arguably illegally placed right in the classified. So it's still a thing.
Yeah, they still do that, and then they just try to argue that it was an essential function of the job, so that they legally, the ADA can't necessarily require them to take that out if they can convincingly argue that's an essential function, but it clearly isn't. A lot of jobs now also have a driver's license requirement that's not necessary. And sometimes it's just out of ignorance because they don't realize, like, some people have state IDs and that's legitimate, an alternate form of identification. But other times it's, it's discriminatory to put that in.
What I was going to add, Dr. Silverman, if it's okay, is what I love about what you've been sharing is while the stories are very powerful and really make us think, the stages and the concepts that you've provided from your experiences really do lead me to think about practical actions for change. That even though you said the stage model you created maybe isn't validated, it does. It rings so true. It makes a lot of sense, and I think people can really relate to that. And just like what I put in the chat, it'd be interesting for us to think about where we are as a community. That seems to be something that people can grab onto and sort of think about, what stage are we in? And the other concept you made that I thought really was a fascinating concept, as a professor, I deal a lot with students myself and trying to get them accommodations, and and I deal with all kinds of students, and I have definitely seen that where there are some students that have what you called invisible disabilities that are struggling to get the accommodations they need, versus maybe what your other point about the accommodations in universities for some of my students that are deaf or blind, those accommodations are maybe you know, more easily understood, they're not I want to say rejected as much, whereas I definitely do have some students who have, you know, learning disabilities or, you know, things like that, where they really have to go through a lot of hoops to get the accommodations that I never thought of it the way you actually presented it before. That really helped me to sort of put understand that. So the stages, I think you have a real gift of taking something that is kind of a difficult psychological concept and making it in a structure that somebody can kind of understand. And I really, really appreciate that.
Well, thank you. I'm glad to hear that you were able to think about like real actions that, you know, can be taken in context of the stages.
Yeah.
The last thing I was going to say before we show the video clip at the end is just in terms of like practical tips for working toward inclusion. You know, I think step one is recognizing that people with disabilities are all around us, and, you know, the value of proactively planning accessibility. And it doesn't just benefit them, but, you know, there's a lot of evidence that inclusion benefits everyone. You know, when we talk to businesses, we tell them that it's not just a nice thing to do to hire more disabled people, but it actually improves your profit margin and, you know, the well-being of, or the morale of other employees and customers and all that. There's a lot of innovations that started out as being disability accommodations, and now, like, for example, word prediction and texting, speech to text things like Siri and things like that started out as being disability accommodations, and now everybody uses them. So when we innovate and we think creatively about who might want to use our services or who might want to be part of our communities, it benefits everyone. Universal design is this whole concept of like making things accessible from the outset, and a lot of it involves like being sure that information is presented in multiple ways in communication, so that someone can read text, or they can listen to something, or they can watch something, and they can get the information way that works best for them. Another kind of related concept to that is providing choices of activities so that someone isn't left out from everyone doing one activity that may not be accessible to everyone. Of course, you know, having someone audit and make sure that your physical facilities are, you know, accessible for people with mobility disabilities. Making sure that your website is accessible, and like newsletters and email communications. You know, if there are pictures, and then making sure that there's an alternative text so that a screen reader knows what the picture is of, those kinds of things. And then also having some kind of a process so that if someone needs accommodations, they know how. First of all, they feel, you know, welcome in asking, and secondly, that they know how to do so.
Dr. Silverman, so helpful, those actions. I really appreciate. I think Seth has a question, if you wouldn't mind. Seth, did you want to ask your question?
Yes, thank you. Dr. Silverman, I believe at the beginning you quoted a number of 26%, I think, something around there, of people had disabilities of some sort. Are we talking about things like color blindness in there, or are we talking about other levels?
Dan, do you know the answer to that?
I believe that is mostly based off of, it's based off of self-identification largely, and it's also based off of, you know, the Americans with Disabilities Act it's written rather broadly and rather vaguely, and so it's looking at more how one is impacted by the presence of a particular characteristic, as opposed to what the nature of that characteristic is, if that makes sense. So I imagine that maybe there are a few people with, say, colorblindness sprinkled in, but, you know, owing to the stigma surrounding invisible disabilities and to just some of our other cultural norms, I would anticipate that if there are a few people like that sprinkled in, they would be few and far between.
Thank you.
Hopefully that long lawyerly answered your question.
It did. Thank you very much.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of subjectivity, and that's part of the reason why it's hard to get like a really solid estimate. But like the census has, or I think it's the American Community Survey, has 6 questions. And it's like, do you have trouble hearing? Do you have trouble seeing even with glasses? So like someone who is colorblind, I probably wouldn't say yes to that unless, but I don't know, maybe if they were doing work that required a lot of color vision that they couldn't do, maybe they would. And then I think the other questions were like, do you have trouble walking or climbing stairs? Do you have trouble with thinking, remembering, or making decisions? Do you have trouble with self-care? And do you have trouble with activities like shopping, or I remember what the other one was, something outside the home. And those questions are hard because even like, I don't know how I would answer, like, do you have trouble going shopping? Like, I don't have trouble, but I need help. You know, I need someone to help me find items because of my blindness. So like, yes, I need an accommodation, but I don't know if that means I have a disability in that area. I guess so. Yeah, so there is a lot of subjectivity in how people answer those questions.
Only thing I would add to that too, if you don't mind, is that when we're having to vocalize that kind of struggle, it takes the reality of that struggle to a whole different depth. I mentioned earlier, for instance, that I have chronic pain from a degenerative connective tissue disorder. Even though I've had several surgeries, even though I deal with inflamed joints all the time, to actually put it out into the world, even if it's just in a private conversation, just to say those words, I struggle with mobility, I struggle with self-care. Even if it's the reality, it's still hard to articulate that. And I think that factors into a lot of the work that we're doing, not only in research-wise, but also when it comes to inclusion, creating that space where sometimes a simple question and even a simple answer can be very difficult to get at based on just the overall emotional process.
Yeah.
Thank you again.
Does anyone else have any questions or comments before we wrap it up with the video? Kathy, I see you joined us about 15 minutes after we started, and just wanted to open up the discussion.
Yeah, thank you. Hi. Yeah. I didn't have a question.
Okay.
I wanted to just, before we move to the video, if it's okay, I wanted to share my screen and just let you know, here's a picture of the book, and Seth already bought it in the middle of our presentation. So thank you, Seth. Hope that's okay to have shared, but you can find it on Amazon. And like I said, it got some great reviews, and I plan on getting it. I think the stages that you created and just the concepts, you know, just really made a lot of sense. So just wanted to point that out.
Well, and just an interesting story about the cover. I haven't told many people about this, but I don't know if you can see there's like these colored orbs around the person on the cover. So I worked with a student a few years ago who was really into electronic dance music, and he had this whole show where he had like all of these lights on him, and they had like all these different colored strobe lights in the middle of his show. And so I wanted to honor him with the book. So I included that design in the cover, and then the person really can be anyone. You know, we made a really intentional decision not to have me on the cover because even though the book is about me, the intended audience is not me. I mean, it's, you know, primarily I would say people of the next generation, but all of us can benefit from the wisdom in the book. So we kind of picked someone who is gender neutral and really could be any of us being lit up by those orbs.
That's beautiful. Thank you for sharing that with us.
Welcome. And so I will, if you guys are ready, I will screen share. This is only about 5 minutes long, but it's a reading from the end of the book, but it's not really a spoiler. It does kind of build on the stage model that I was talking through, and then it gives you a little foreshadowing of what each chapter is about. So I thought it would be kind of a fun way to conclude the talk. Make sure my audio is shared. Hear it. And you will hear my screen reader a little bit. I apologize for that. I'll try to keep it to a minimum.
Title is meeting control. Essays to move to an item. A news check title. Not selected graduation reading trans. Just graduate. Not selected graduation. Graduation enter. Movies and TV. Pop-up graduate.
Stage 5 is meant to be an ideal state of being within a community, a state when all people are equally valued, all identities are positively acknowledged, and all differences are celebrated. Reaching this stage requires effort, creativity, and perseverance. It requires us to actively redirect some of our most basic instincts, the evolved human drive to distance ourselves from others who are not like us or who appear to be a threat. Stage 5 also requires us to dismantle systems of inequality built and reinforced for centuries. In Stage 5, we recognize that, although racism and ableism may have very different consequences, they both originate from a common instinct to favor certain bodies as superior to others. A hallmark of Stage 5 is the awareness of diversity as a strength, not a failing. Though we are still falling far short of Stage 5, we have made tremendous progress over time. This gives me hope we are still capable of progressing further. In June 2020, several of our students graduated from high school. What a strange, unforgettable senior year these students had. On a Zoom call, Melissa shared a video of her virtual graduation. As I watched, I heard the familiar melody of Pomp and Circumstance. This same melody played during my 3 graduations, from high school in 2003, my bachelor's degree in 2007, and my PhD in 2014. The familiar tune transports my mind back to each graduation and their common mood. Each graduation was an end, but also a beginning, a commencement. Each time I heard that song and walked across the stage, I felt the infinite freedom of the future as one chapter ended and a new one began. I felt that sense of open time and space extending ahead and the power to shape it however I wished. I remember riding home from each commencement ceremony, sleeping deeply that night, and waking up the next day feeling a sense of complete freedom to shape the next chapter of my life. We may never graduate from our prejudices, but each of us has the power to shape our own lives, the lives of our loved ones, and the collective path of our communities. We can make things better for the generations who come after us, even if we cannot reverse what has already been done. As I look into the open space of the future and consider my past, I think of my dreams for the young people who will come after me. I dream they will be born into a world where their uniqueness is expected, not a surprise, where their parents will support them to explore their world from the bottom up, where they will greet every can't with a why not, where they will recognize their privilege and use it for good, where they will find good archaeologists and careful people who accept them without reservation, where they will find at least one loyal ally through adversity, where they will find true friends like KJ and teachers who believe in them like Mrs. Gersh, where they will remember that the best years of their life have yet to come, where every person's contributions will matter, where they will find the person in whose embrace they feel completely secure, where it's okay to get lost, where they are treated as people with full humanity, ordinary others, and experts on their own needs, where they are empowered to use their big voices and to play to their own beats, where authorities stop, ask, and listen to their needs, where they can stim loud and proud, Somewhere at this moment, a newborn like me draws their first breath, a person whose body or mind is somehow different from the norm. Like mine, this person's earliest memories will emerge from the stories others tell them. Let us all join together to welcome their birth as an unquestionable gain.
Play button to activate. Essays to move to meeting controls. Meet all day.
Right.
Well, now that was beautiful. Wouldn't you all agree?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Silverman.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Silverman. We have gotten so much from this presentation, and we're just really grateful for you coming and sharing your, your wisdom with us. And we hope to get, take some of these ideas back to our Temple community and make us as, as inclusive as we possibly can be. Thank you very much. I know I say that for all the members of the committee, but we are so grateful for your wisdom. Thank you so much. Anybody have any other comments they would like to make before we close it out for today?
Yes, thank you, Dr. Silverman.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks everyone for being here. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to stop the recording now. Obviously, I forgot.